The first comeback mechanic that comes to mind for me is item probability in Mario Kart. It's easy enough to understand. The further back you are from first, the higher your chances of getting a better item. When you're in first, you usually get items like bananas and green shells. As you go further back in the pecking order, you'll notice items like Bullet Bill, Superstar, and the infamous blue shell start to show up a little more often when you drive through that item box. The point here is to make it so lesser skilled players can keep up with more skilled players, and so they're not just in last for the entire game. Mario Kart is about family fun after all. So what happens when you take a genre where the better player is supposed to win and give it a comeback mechanic? Say, I don't know, fighting games? Well, in order to answer that question, I want to talk about some comeback mechanics in older forms of competition. One of the most familiar forms of this is the way a lot of American sports have their draft order set up. In the NFL, the team with the worst record gets the first pick in the following draft, and the team that won the Super Bowl gets the last pick of the first round. The idea here is the league wants parity in who is able to win, so a potentially franchise-changing first pick of the draft should go to the franchise that needs changing the most. You also don't want the rich to get richer by allowing them to get a high draft pick. The idea of balance here is that most teams want to win, so they won't lose on purpose. There have been instances where teams clear their rosters of their meaningful players in order to purposefully lose, called tanking, but it's debatable whether tanking is a worthwhile strategy for future success. Another example that's a bit more swingy is the game show Jeopardy! At the end of each show, the player with the lowest score gets the first pick in Double Jeopardy! Since you are allowed to answer multiple questions in a row as long as you get the previous question right, this opens up an opportunity for the lowest scoring player to catch up and overtake the rest of the field. The issue here is, there's no guarantee you'll be the first to buzz in or get the question right if you are. In my opinion, it's not worth the risk and the pressure to purposefully put yourself in last place by the end of the show, but if you've ever watched, you've seen the last place contestant get hot and rob the other contestants of a win. So now we get into fighting games. The community at large often speaks about comeback mechanics as though they're a new development of modern fighting games, though I'd argue they're a staple of the genre in general. In the arcade staple Capcom vs SNK 2, you're allowed to use super moves more liberally when your character is at low health, in certain character configurations. In the original Samurai Showdown, getting hit filled a rage meter that either allowed you to do extra damage or do a special desperation attack once filled. I will say though that the X Factor mechanic of 2009's Marvel vs. Capcom 3 seemed to have a large ripple effect in subsequent games, where many new IPs came standard with some type of comeback mechanic, and new iterations of established IPs added one. Unbalanced comeback mechanics in fighting games can make the player experience a negative feedback loop, where it feels like players are rewarded for losing and penalized for winning. In some more egregious cases, it can feel like the better player doesn't consistently win. Obviously, this isn't good for an inherently competitive genre, as the game can feel like it's not rewarding the player for investing time into improving. There's also the idea of mechanics that introduce a positive feedback loop, where players who are doing well early are rewarded heavily. The homie Chris has a few ideas and examples on that, so I'm gonna pass it to him. What's the word, C-Saint?
Hold on, Simon, let me take over this video for a second. It's important to note when we talk about comeback mechanics, we're not saying that you should only reward the dominant player. That will lead to snowballing, and no one likes that. Snowballing means that a team or player gets ahead early in the game and will continue to get more ahead by just playing the game until the game is won. They usually have comeback mechanics to balance this, but there have been examples where there's a game that only rewards good playing and snowballing. An example of that, NFL Streets. When you do good on offense, when you do good on defense, you fill up a meter, that's your game breaker. A game breaker does just that. It breaks the game in your favor. I'm talking the most untackleable, hardest juking, fastest running, hardest tackling, fumble every single time they touch you. And I mean every time they touch you. Motherfuckers jumping 12 feet in the air for interceptions. It lasts for an entire drive until you get a turnover, score, or the other team somehow takes the ball from you if you use their game breaker on defense. And NFL Streets 2 is an even more egregious example of that because they have a game breaker level 2. And Game Breaker Level 2 is just a cutscene. There's literally nothing you can do to defend that. Exhibit has thrown so many off-the-wall touchdown passes to me, it just gives me nightmares. And that right there is the imbalance. If I'm getting my ass kicked Why can't you just throw me a bone? Not something that will completely shift the tide, but something that'll just help me compete. Another egregious example of snowballing is the WWE 2K game. You have to pin your opponent down for a 3 count. The way you do that is you do damage to where they can't kick out. The thing that'll help you do the most damage is your finisher. So the more moves you do, the more finisher you get. If you do your finisher, usually they can't kick out of that. The reason why that's a bit imbalanced is because the only way you're going to get a finisher is by doing moves. If you're on defense a lot, you're not doing moves, so you're not filling up your finisher. That, coupled with the fact that you have limited reversals, makes you a sitting duck for a lot of the time. The overall issue with snowballing mechanics is that it makes the game fun for only the winner and not competitive throughout the whole game, even in defeat. If your fighting game ever gets to a point where you can just put the controller down, your fighting game has failed. Back to you, Simon.
Appreciate you, Chris. There are less polarizing, more balanced comeback mechanics that have less of a negative feedback loop and instead add a level of intensity as the match progresses. So let's go over 7 popular comeback mechanics in fighting games. 3 that I think employ the concept poorly, 2 that I think are good ideas but poorly executed, and 2 that I absolutely love. Let's get into it. I'm grouping Limit Break and Sparking together because while Sparking was problematic before Season 3, it became much more annoying when the 3rd season of the game added the Limit Break mechanic. Sparking is a one-time usage mode where characters do more damage, have more options in the air and on the ground, and regain blue health. The fewer characters you have left, the longer Sparking lasts. Limit Break is a permanent damage buff you obtain when you're left with one character on your team. When combined, a character can melt the life bar of the opponent. I don't mind Sparking as much as a concept because the player has to choose when to do it, and there's like this argument that it would be better to use on your point character to protect your team, as 3 characters are better than 2 characters are better than 1, and so on. But a lot of people Hail Mary Spark their last character in Limit Break to abuse that damage. I think the reward for Sparking in Limit Break is still far too high. Rage is a mechanic introduced in Tekken 6 that increased the damage output a character could do after being in low health, 5% to be exact. In every subsequent Tekken game, Rage has gotten stronger. In Tekken 7, you get Rage, a Rage Drive, which is basically an EX move, like a better version of your normal moves, and you get a Rage Art, which is more like a super move. But can I be honest with y'all real quick between you and me? I don't know anything about Tekken, but the homie Chris does. Welcome back, C-Saint, was good.
Nope. I thought I was done. I'm not. He said something about Tekken. I need to chime in. Tekken is one of the worst examples of this. Specifically Tekken 7, because they didn't have this mechanic until Tekken 7. Now, I understand that the intention of this mechanic is to bridge the gap between newer players and more seasoned players, right? Right. The problem with it is that veteran characters can still use this mechanic. So there's still a gap that needs to be bridged. But when you add a 1 input attack in your game that's basically a cutscene, how much of a gap are you really bridging? So what ends up happening, it's not like people just use the Rage Art mechanic and then that's just that. And mind you, I don't have a problem with the Rage Drives. That's just extra damage in a different move. That's fair. But the Rage Art, which is just a cutscene, I have a huge problem with, because again, it's not like people are just standing and using the moves. No, they use it to finish off combos that your opponent can't block, has to just sit there for. If you're getting juggled and they use this combo, that's it. Newer players aren't going to utilize the Rage Art that way. Newer players are just going to use it as a Hail Mary, hoping that they can get something, but more seasoned players are still going to take advantage of it, thus creating this gap between the people who know what they're doing and the people who don't. This wouldn't be such a problem if there were more defensive options in Tekken, which is an entirely different conversation, but there's not. In Tekken, there's not too many ways to defend because Tekken doesn't reward defensive playing. Most fighting games don't reward defensive playing. This is just another form of offense to have in your repertoire, which looks flashy in tournaments, but it limits the creativity of gameplay that you can actually have. So yeah, for me personally, comeback mechanics aren't really my jam. I feel like if I'm whooping ass, you shouldn't be able to completely shift the tide just because you suck. Reward me for doing good. That's why I play the game. That being said, there's a balance that needs to happen between making the game competitive and completely shifting the tide. You shouldn't be rewarded for losing, because it becomes less of rewarding them for losing and more of punishing me for winning. And how fair is that when I'm just better at the game than you are? So yeah, thanks for letting me join this video, Simon. I appreciate you. I've been C-Saint, and yeah, back to you, Simon.
Appreciate you, Chris. Rage was a mechanic introduced in Super Smash Bros. For the Wii U and 3DS that made characters do higher knockback the more damage they had. For whatever reason, it was a lot more knockback. A lot of the good characters in the game were able to abuse the mechanic to the point where an enraged character could take your stock at 0 whenever they got a grab. This is probably my least favorite comeback mechanic, as it either rewards the losing player or, in the instance of a close game, snowballed the result. This mechanic still exists in Ultimate, but to a much less invasive degree. But you know it was busted in 4 if you watch tournaments, because the commentators still bring it up all these years later. Them boys got PTSD. On to the mixed bag mechanics. X Factor, the one that started the craze. X Factor is a mechanic that makes characters faster and do more damage. It also gets better the fewer characters your team has. There's no mistaking X Factor was put into MVC3 as an explicit comeback mechanic. The reason I like it a little bit though, especially compared to the Limit Break and Sparking mechanic, is that it's just more hype. When you see X Factor pop up, somebody's gonna die. Straight up. I love V-Trigger as an idea, but it doesn't work well in practice. In Street Fighter V, characters can pick a V-Trigger and a V-Skill. The V-Skill is pretty much a command move that varies greatly, but the V-Trigger is a super mode a character goes into on activation. It can give you a new move, power up existing moves, juice your damage, and so on. Most V-Triggers allow you to do much more damage than normal, and you can activate it off a connected normal on block or on hit. Did I mention V-Gauge is filled by getting hit? It's quite common to see a player get thoroughly outplayed for 65% of the round, pop V-Trigger, and turn the round completely in their favor. Another epitome of the negative feedback loop. Shout out to my guy Adon, by the way. It's on the screen. I just had to say, I damn near cried when this happened to you, bro. So if you ever see this, man, I'm sorry I had to put this in here. But let's get to the best comeback mechanics. Meter and KOF is probably my favorite implementation of a comeback mechanic. It's mild, but it clearly has an impact on the game. In the beginning of a round, the max amount of meter your character can gain is 3 bars. Once you lose a character, you get 4 bars, and on your last character, you get a full 5. This means characters' damage output and meter consumption can be higher the further you put them back on the team. This has many implications on gameplay. From a basic standpoint, if you lose your first character, you should be able to outdamage the opponent's character in the next round. From a team building standpoint, this is the main function that determines synergy. Can you do well in the neutral without using meter, or do you gain meter quickly? Get in the front. Do you do well in max mode but not use a lot of EX moves? Be my mid. Are EX moves a large part of your game plan, or do you otherwise use meter very well? Anchor me down. In my opinion, it's the best way to keep games close without outright rewarding the losing player. BlazBlue Overdrive is probably the best implementation of the sparking or X Factor type of mechanic in my opinion. Overdrive is a mode you go into where certain moves are powered up, the timer stops, and you lock your opponent out of burst. The lower your health, the longer Overdrive lasts. It sounds almost as powerful as the other two in this class, but instead of being a given that you activate it once per game, you need a full burst meter to do it. This makes it so the choice between bursting a combo and saving it for Overdrive is a consequential one. It's not a certainty that you should even use it in the first place. Mechanics that use a meaningful resource instead of being their own resource are always going to be better in my book. So what did we learn? Having a comeback mechanic in your game is extremely hard to balance, but if done correctly, it can be something fun to play around and extremely hype for viewership. I just don't know if I trust future fighting games to implement them in ways that have enough consequence for their use. Fighting games should prioritize the best player winning first, and a good comeback mechanic just slightly closes the gap and or keeps things interesting. But that's just my opinion. Y'all let me know in the comments if I'm a genius or if I'm tripping. Until next time though, I'm about to abuse Broly and Limit Break and Sparking. Peace.